wave of diplomacy sweeping the Horn of Africa is bringing Eritrea in from the cold. But what does that mean for millions of Eritreans?
Today we'll consider whether the recent spirit of openness between Eritrea and its neighbours is filtering down to its people. Send your thoughts via Twitter and YouTube for today's show.
For years a pariah state, it appears the door is opening for Eritrea to rejoin the international community.
Just last week, the UN Security Council lifted an arms embargo and targeted sanctions against the country. The restrictions had been in place since 2009 following controversial allegations that Eritrea had supported al-Shabaab fighters in Somalia. Eritrea considers the sanctions unjust and illegal.
The Security Council vote comes amid sweeping diplomatic change in the Horn of Africa. In July, Eritrea's President Isaias Afwerki signed a peace deal with Ethiopia's Prime Minister, bringing an end to simmering border disputes. And Eritrea's relations with Somalia and Djibouti are also thawing after years of friction.
But millions of Eritreans are waiting to see if Isaias' government will work to improve human rights. In recent years, thousands of people have fled Eritrea to escape indefinite military national service that the UN has called enslavement. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International say there are severe limits on freedom of speech and assembly, and that arbitrary arrest and imprisonment is common.
So what are the prospects for Eritreans leading better lives as the country mends relations with its neighbours? To discuss this, we are joined by SALEM Solomon. She is a multimedia journalist with Voice of America's Africa division.
In Lund, Sweden, we have RAHEL, WELDEAB SEBHATU. She is a political scientist and researcher. She's also an advisor to the Africa Youth Movement.
Awet Welder-Michael is an associate professor of African and world history at Queen's University. He focuses on developments in the Horn of Africa. He joins us from the Canadian province of Ontario. Hello, everybody. It's really good to have you here. RAHEL, I just want to remind our audience, plus you, about this headline. It's from VOA, Voice of America, from their website. UN Security Council lifts sanctions against Eritrea. Do you remember where you were, what you felt? Describe that moment when you heard about it.
I was actually on my way to pick up my son from daycare, and I thought it was going to be a very long process. I had started watching the live UN feed, but the time I got downstairs, listening to what they were saying, it seemed like they already had the vote. And then that followed with many delegations from around the world congratulating the peace that's been taking place across the Horn of Africa and the state of Eritrea for its involvement in that.
Emotional or just a diplomatic move for you?
For me, I mean, I felt emotional, of course, but it felt like the almost decade-long of struggle against these unjust sanctions it was coming to an end, and I felt very vindicated, actually. The reasons why the sanctions was put there in the first place were very political, and the same process, the political process that made those sanctions come about was the reason why it was lifted. Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed had visited Eritrea, I believe it was in June or July, and the next day after, he took a flight from Eritrea to Ethiopia and had a meeting with the UN Secretary General like around noon that day. And the first thing he did was present a letter requesting that the UN would lift Eritrean sanctions. So we've been anticipating this, and now it feels very good. It feels great. I'm very happy, and I continue to celebrate. I'll be celebrating this for a very long time.
RAHEL, you won't be the only one. You said you felt vindicated. I want to share this tweet from Sia Ahmed, who likely felt the same way. This person says, this is a positive development. The apparent isolation of Eritrea was actually uncalled for. So this is a new era of engagement for the Eritreans. But on the other side of that coin are views like this. This is from Fish Hailu, who says, I think for Eritreans, it would be better to lift Isaias Afwerki rather than sanctions. Lifting sanctions means authorizing him for further atrocities and allowing him to acquire weapons. He's the most difficult burden for innocent people, not the sanctions. So nothing has changed. Salem, can you explain to us why we see these two very competing, these very different views?
So in the beginning of the sanctions, when sanctions were imposed in 2009, there was a lot of proxy war going on between Ethiopia and Eritrea. So this Ethiopia has used this, a way of isolating, I think, the country for a while. But in the early stages of the sanctions, before Al-Shabaab became Al-Shabaab, used to be Islamic Courts Union. And I think there was some meddling and proxy war going on. Eventually, the UN launched an investigation, didn't find any evidence that Eritrea was supporting Al-Shabaab. So there was no reason to have it. But mind you, that sanctions were toothless. So they were targeted. They were targeting government officials who traveled, by the way, even though there were restrictions. They didn't have assets to freeze anyway. So, it was toothless in that way, but it had symbolic ramifications. I mean, foreign governments cannot do business with the country in that way. So it had indirect issues. But the thing is, what that means for average Eritreans, when you're thinking about internal issues like national service, that is indefinite. When you're thinking about internal issues that affect average Eritreans, that is now a subject or a topic to be talked about because the government has used the sanctions and also hostilities between Ethiopia and Eritrea for many years as a first reason to basically not prioritize when they're criticized about their human rights records, when they're criticized about internal issues like civil society, crushing down of the media, and all these things that matter most to Eritreans within.
Awek, you're looking so thoughtful. Can we start with what this means for the neighbours around Eritrea and Eritrea's relationship with its near neighbours?
Well, thank you. In the first place, these sanctions were brought about in the context of hostility between Eritrea and Ethiopia, and Ethiopian diplomatic success and success in its alignment with the US in the global war on terror. The fact that there is a new government in Ethiopia, the direct effect of it has been normalization of relations with Eritrea. In Ethiopia, I mean, the new government in Ethiopia, the snowball effect of it was the lifting of the sanctions. It's a good sign because we have decades long of unsuccessful sanctions which hurt the people more than the governments or the individuals that they targeted. In light of that, it is a positive sign that this albatross, so to speak, has been removed from the country, from its image, and any long-term harm that could have come from it on the population has been removed. That's a great positive thing. But its full effect on the daily lives of individuals cannot be really exaggerated because it was targeted. Significant parts of it were not implemented. As SALEM was saying, this has a lot more symbolic weight than substantive weight. But the fact that it's lifted and the fact that all countries in the region have come around Eritrea to support this lifting of the sanctions is indicative of the positive diplomatic dynamics that's going on in the region. The question, however, is that each of these countries have internal problems, and because Eritrea is the topic of our conversation, it's time that we start talking of the stagnated political reality, the decayed conditions in Eritrea as a result of government policies, actions and inactions.
Sure. We're having a very rich conversation with the three of you. We also tried to reach authorities in Eritrea or get a government voice. We were unable to reach that government voice, but I know that certain Eritreans are very active on Twitter. So if we see it and we'll look out for it, those comments, we will bring them into the show while we're doing the live show. Malika.
So a couple of people mentioned the word positive here, and so that's what I want to pick up on. I heard the stagnation that you talked about in your comments there, Awet, and so we will get to that, but I wanted to bring this in because it echoed something I heard earlier. So Nashan here on Twitter says, this is a positive step in helping to ease the tension between the two countries, Ethiopia and Eritrea. I was in northern Ethiopia a few weeks ago on assignment, and I witnessed lots of positive energy and optimism. So that's the view from across the border. We also got this video comment from someone, though, who is a human rights activist, Selam Kidani, in London, and she also talks about some of the positives. Have a listen.
Recent developments in Eritrea have resulted in so much change in the region. The sanctions have been lifted, borders have been opened, and there's diplomatic and other relationships across the region, which is a positive development that we all welcome. However, the situation inside Eritrea hasn't changed, particularly the things that have been of concern to human rights activists and people who are concerned about the Eritrean public in general.
So Rahel, she mentioned those diplomatic relations that she sees as being a positive out of this. What's your view on that?
I agree. I mean, it's definitely a positive move in terms of the international community. But this idea that this has now opened Eritrea's participation in diplomatic talks and negotiations out of like a complete darkness, I think is a bit dishonest. Eritrea has had diplomatic relations with various countries prior to the lifting of the sanctions. And in fact, I mean, I can mention, for instance, South Africa has played a major role in creating a bridge between different bilateral actors advocating for the lifting of the sanctions. Also with the European Union, you recall the year, was it 2011? The European Union, after negotiating with the Eritrean government on its terms, decided to continue with the European Development Fund. So there has been diplomatic relations. This is just, how can you say, this in itself, and the fact that peace has been developed, really just exploding over the region because of the peace agreement between Eritrea and Ethiopia, of course it's going to get better. I mean, for business, for development, for cooperation, social, economic, cultural. I mean, I think the sky's really the limit, and we just have to give it time.
Salam,
there's a bright future ahead.
But here, yes, Eritrea did have diplomatic relations. Yes, Eritrea had positive engagement with its partners. But you cannot underestimate the fact that it was considered pariah, rightly or wrongly. Again, I do not put value judgment on that assessment, but you cannot underestimate the value of the fact that Eritrea was deemed pariah state and was subject of sanctions. Again, just or unjust is an altogether different question we can get into. But all these are important negative marks on Eritrea's record, and a country that accomplished much in asserting the human rights of its people through its liberation struggle and independence, which is a fundamental human right, to be within a decade or two to be associated with the mere association of being implicated with terrorist groups. Not that it was, but the fact that it was is a big diplomatic blow to Eritrea and on Eritrea's record.
And also just to add to this conversation about diplomatic relationships, here's the thing. Even when the peace deal was signed and declarations and joyous reunification of families that you've seen, families separated because of this war for 20 years, the Eritrean people don't have agency at this point. Because in 1993, when independence, the referendum was, Eritrea became independence, we haven't seen elections. We haven't seen a government. All these deals are done without the agency of the people. So we don't know what these agreements are at this point. Me as a reporter working on these issues, for instance, when we want to see what is being signed, for instance, these are basic asks about what is going on, who is signing on behalf of who. These are the things that are not discussed. So you can talk about Eritrea as a country, but let's talk about the government structure here. The General Assembly hasn't assembled since 2002. We haven't seen elections since 1993. The last time the president was asked if there are going to be elections on this channel, I think it was Al Jazeera, he said 20, 30 years, I don't know. But the excuse and the reason that's been given is that we don't want sham election to make it seem like there's a democratic process and continue autocratic governments. But fundamentally, Eritreans fought for 30 years for independence just so they could have a government that represents their needs and have a transparent process where they see what is being signed on their behalf.
So here's the question. What has changed? What did November the 14th, what did the lifting of the sanctions do that changed that situation? RAHEL?
We're talking about less than a week, right? It happened last Wednesday. And, to talk about this single event, having, that would, give this type of drastic change overnight, I think it's
too ambitious. Too ambitious.
It's not just too ambitious. I mean,
what do you hope for?
30 years to, gain liberation. It took only 7 years for a border conflict to ignite. A year after, the decision on the border was given. It took then another, 18 years until the peace agreement was, written, at least a true one, between Eritrea and Ethiopia right now. I mean, we cannot expect, democracy and economic prosperity to happen within, we're talking about like 7 days, 7 days.
But also, the peace between Ethiopia and Eritrea, that has been happening for a much longer period of time.
If I can jump in, the peace deal has happened, and what came out of this is that the President, Isaias Afwerki, and his government have come out strong. So if you stick with me for as long as you do, 20 years plus, and sacrifice as much, then you get the result, is what the message comes out. Be it the peace deal, be it the lifting of sanctions. But the flip side of that coin is that now Eritrean people have highest expectation for whatever it is that they sacrificed for 20 years to see the result of that.
So the domestic, if I can jump in here, the domestic life of the country entirely and every aspect of it has been held hostage by a succession of crises. There was the border with Ethiopia, there was the state of no war, no peace that lasted until just last June, and then there were sanctions in between, and there were many other mishaps that happened in the past 2 decades. So the life of the country, economically, politically, in every respect, was held hostage to that. And every modest, and by modest I mean in every sense of the word modest, request for improvement in the internal situation was rebuffed under the guise that Eritrea was facing existential threats in this form or that form. So yes, I agree with RAHEL that 7 days is too short, but as you correctly pointed out, this process is a snowball process that started in early June, officiated in July, and throughout we have not heard any official statement from the government whereby it can tell its citizenry X, Y, and Z have happened, and now we're moving to A, B, and C. So we haven't seen that. Again, 7 days is too short for a government to make any meaningful change on the ground. But at least one, as a citizen, one would expect a declaration of intention, especially in light of the fact that now the two major hurdles to Eritrea's internal political and economic life have now been effectively removed, which is that the border conflict with Ethiopia, the state of no war, no peace has ended, the sanctions have lifted, which are the two main hurdles or the two main excuses, depending on where you stand on the political spectrum, that prevented the Eritrean government from responding positively to people's demand for change in the internal affairs. Now, the hope is that there is no more excuse for the political
I hear both of you. Malika.
Someone who would agree with at least part of that is Elias here on YouTube, who says lifting the sanctions is a slight reminder to us. Can't turn around the hardship overnight. So, of course, not enough time is what people are saying. But there is this criticism here from Vanessa Berhe, who says the change in foreign relations has actually nothing to do with domestic change. And at best, it gives opponents of the Eritrean regime, she says, more ground to stand on when advocating for human rights in the country, as the excuses that the government once had are now gone. She sent us a video comment to elaborate on those that point that she raised there, and I want you to have a listen to it.
Since Eritrea became a dictatorship, the Eritrean government has used the war with Ethiopia or the no war, no peace situation as an excuse for its oppressive politics. But the fact that nothing changed following the peace deal this summer, the national service remains indefinite, the National Assembly has still not been opened, the Constitution has still not been implemented, proves that this was never about national security. This is simply about a government that wanted full control over its people. And we need to stop entertaining this idea that the lifting of economic sanctions or the improvement of relations between not only Ethiopia but other foreign countries is going to change anything in Eritrea. The problem in Eritrea lies with the Eritrean government, and as long as they're in power, no significant or meaningful change is ever going to happen.
RAHEL?
This thing that Vanessa calls excuses, I think there were very solid reasons for the way that things happened in Eritrea after the border war and before the peace agreement. But this idea that nothing has changed in Eritrea since the peace agreement is false. I think one of the biggest changes is the opening of the border, the demilitarization and the opening of the border, where people can, cross it without any permit, without a passport, without even, making any type of declaration of when they're going to come back. That is a very significant effect of the peace deal. Not just that, people are also.
I'd like to jump in here about the process in which the economy. So before the sanctions, before even the border conflict, Eritrea has a command economy. The government controls everything. Even as simple as an entrepreneur trying to open a business is extremely hard. One thing that's not even talked about is how successful Eritreans are in neighboring countries. When you go to a war-torn place like South Sudan and you sell tea to make money to return it back home, that shows you the level of how people are not even able to, entrepreneurs to operate as they want. Military service is another way of controlling the population that we've seen.
So let me bring in something that is more positive than the track that we're going on right now, which is the idea of business coming back into Eritrea and thriving. These are people in the Eritrean port of Massawa talking about the potential for tourism. Have a listen.
There were times we didn't have a single person coming to dine or stay at our hotel. Often, not a single person to receive or host. But now we have started to work a lot.
My happiness is limitless. Now this place will thrive. There will be business as our Ethiopian brothers will start coming here and having good times here. We will welcome them with all we have. Overall, I think this place will come alive again.
All right, look at those smiles, look at the positivity. If you were going to suggest a place for people who are watching this around the world where they could go in Eritrea, where would you take them? Where would you show them? It's been a while since you've been back home.
Well, I don't know. I'm not even sure where exactly I would go, so I wouldn't recommend anything for anybody. But let me say something, and this may be a topic for a future discussion here on Al Jazeera. Much as I celebrate the peace, much as I celebrate the lifting of the sanctions, much as I celebrate the bringing Eritrea from the cold, the way it is happening is of concern. The fact that internally Eritrean legal system, the Eritrean system of the absence of rule of law, the fact that the militarization of Eritrean society is still in place. In the past few days, the men of a certain age are required to report for training. These are old men mostly. So internally, not much has changed. Of course, in a week, we don't expect much. But even the way the border is operating right now is not something to be happy about. Although the movement of people and goods is something to be welcomed, this unregulated interaction is not helpful. That was part of the reason we went into conflict to begin with.
All right.
So we have to walk this very cautiously.
Milika.
Because we're talking about the economy there, I want to end with this tweet from Emmanuel, who says the economy is yet to recover, but there will be steady cash flow to the government, like from the port that Ethiopia and other nations have started using, and investments by private institutions will also see a boost. Something to look out for.
Thank you very much, guests, for being part of this conversation about Eritrea and where does it go to next and its future. Now it is in a post-sanctions era. We appreciate your comments and your questions and your input. We will always be online at AJ Stream on Twitter. Thanks for watching. See you next time.